Hey everyone, welcome to another All Tech is Human weekly live stream. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Rebekah Tweed. I'm the Executive Director at All Tech is Human. We are a New York-based nonprofit bringing together a global community of thousands of people to build the world's largest multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary network in responsible tech. We emphasize leveraging our collective intelligence to more effectively tackle complex tech and society issues so that we can co-create a tech future that's aligned with the public interest. We're looking to diversify tech to include more backgrounds, disciplines, and lived experiences so that we're best positioned to meet the challenges that we face as a society. And we emphasize greatly increasing the pace of tech consideration to meet the challenges of the moment. Tech is not slowing down. We need to move at the speed of tech. Our goal is to build and strengthen the responsible tech ecosystem, and we do this through multi-stakeholder collaboration and community building, multidisciplinary education and resource development, and our extensive career development work to build and strengthen the responsible tech talent pipeline. So please check out all the ways you can get involved at alltechishuman.org. We have a mentorship program, a university network, working groups, an affiliate program. We have a talent matchmaking program and the Responsible Tech Job Board. And of course, we have many upcoming events focused on responsible AI, trust and safety, public interest tech, and more. Okay, so we're going to jump right into today's discussion. This is part of our weekly live stream series. I am absolutely thrilled and honored to be joined today by Dr. Rumman Chowdhury, co-founder and CEO of Humane Intelligence, a tech nonprofit building a community of practice around algorithmic evaluations. Rumman is also the United States Science Envoy for Artificial Intelligence for the US State Department and a member of the Artificial Intelligence Safety and Security Board for the US Department of Homeland Security. So hi, Rumman, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's an exciting day, at least on my end of the world, so glad to be here.
Yes. So in our conversation today, we are going to be discussing the recently released transparency report detailing the findings from the Generative AI Red Teaming Challenge that you hosted last August at DEF CON's AI Village. This was the largest ever generative AI public red teaming event for closed source API models. And everyone watching, please check that report out. It is at humane-intelligence.org. You can download that, dig into it, and also the data set itself is posted on GitHub, and that is available in full to explore, so please check that out as well. We will be taking questions, so if you're watching this live on LinkedIn, please drop a question into the comment section, and everyone let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments as well. So, okay, Rumman, want to kick things off here with just a simple intro question. Can you give us some background on the Generative AI Red Teaming Challenge?
Yeah, it was born out of an idea that actually 3 organizations had: AI Village, Seed AI, and Humane Intelligence. And the idea was to think through this concept of red teaming as a way of getting public feedback, right? So like how can everyday people be engaged in the process of finding issues in AI? And the other problem that's always very interesting to me personally and embedded in all the work I've ever done is how do we take these broad social concepts and operationalize them? So what we designed for the Generative AI Red Teaming Challenge was an operationalization of the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights, which was written by Dr. Landra Nelson, Suresh Venkata-Subramaniam, and others. So it's an articulation of the rights that we should have, right? Things like privacy, freedom from surveillance, et cetera. But how do we make sure that the models are actually adhering to them? And this space of testing evaluations of generative AI models in particular is so unique and frankly new. And it was such an amazing opportunity to get, I actually say it was kind of a once in a lifetime moment where you had policymakers, companies, people sort of aligned on this shared mission. So I want to point out that by design, it was a collaborative development process. So every 2 weeks, I would run this call that had representatives from all the major companies, from nonprofits, and from these different groups and agencies, including MITRE, NIST, OSTP. And it was kind of a beautiful moment because we all agreed that this is important. We need to think about these challenges. We need to address these issues affecting, how artificial intelligence impacts society. But let's all get together behind figuring out how to do it.
Yeah. And how did you choose DEF CON to be the venue for this exercise?
DEF CON has a very unique and interesting spirit that I love. It's a hacker conference. So if you've never been, take every idea you have about a conference, throw it out the window. That's not DEF CON. DEF CON is definitely weird. It's definitely quirky. It's definitely hands-on. This is an environment, is a community of practice that thrives on finding problems in things with the intent of fixing it. And it's really that ethos that I wanted to tap into. And it's interesting because actually a lot of government entities and officials are there because traditionally it's a cybersecurity conference. But I really wanted to embed this in a community of practitioners and people who tend to think a little bit out of the box, and because that's what we need in this world right now.
Definitely. And one thing I think is very interesting about this is that it is intentionally a public red teaming event.
Yep.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Can you tell us functionally, what's the value of public versus expert red teaming, and in what context should each of those be done?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I've actually put a lot of thought behind this. So, companies tend to do expert red teaming where they curate people with degrees in a particular subject, topic, et cetera, to help them understand how to stress test their model. So like the ones that are the most pointed to are like virologists and, people who are chemists, et cetera. And it usually is linked to these ideas of people maliciously using artificial intelligence for some nefarious purpose, right? But public red team is a little bit different. My shorthand way of putting it is actually it's not about a thing you get a degree in. It's about your lived experience, right? So we know that these AI systems fall apart when they're faced with multicultural context, with anything that is not a very traditional Western and frankly often just American Silicon Valley heterosexual white male. I can just keep going down this list. Like it is very fine-tuned for a very particular audience, set of people and set of needs. And it doesn't really work well for other people. And the way this is not something we get a degree in. It's my lived experience or your lived experience because, let's say I grew up a child of immigrants speaking a different language in a household. How does it reflect? How do AI systems reflect the kinds of known values that I share? So public red teaming serves a very specific purpose. It actually is meant to understand the systemic harms of systems and the way that they may at scale reflect issues in society, but also it helps people, it helps with these, what's often called like an edge case. I don't always like that language because it is like by definition othering, but it is what would be considered an edge case, right? So it's a part of society that is not part of, quote, the norm, the average data that's represented, but that is equally important. So public red teaming really serves to really tackle these communities of concern that are not usually represented in Silicon Valley, which is very different from expert red teaming, which again, you get kind of 20 academics within a PhD in a particular topic and they do this testing. It's messy. It's definitely very messy. It's definitely very undefined, but part of the purpose of doing this exercise was to help build some structure around how this can be useful moving forward.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me to a question of what some of your goals were for this initiative. You mentioned the messiness and kind of, what you're doing to build some structure for that. Are there some other goals that you had for this larger initiative?
Yeah, so I'll start with maybe with like a slightly more abstract goal and then something a little bit more concrete. In a more abstract sense, right? We're seeing all of these advances in AI models coming out constantly, right? And this week was actually such a great example of it. We have GPT-4o, we have all of Google I/O, where now they're telling us they're going to replace search engines with AI. And it seems like whether or not we want it, it's being pushed upon us. And people feel increasingly alienated. A Pew report from November showed that 53% of Americans felt more concerned than excited about AI. And this number has been, that number has been increasing. The percent of people concerned has been going up over the last few years. And that seems to be in inverse correlation with the amount of technology being shoved upon us, right? So there's something here, right? People feel like an afterthought. People feel alienated. one reason to A, bring this to maybe a slightly atypical community, but also B, to spend a lot of time and effort bringing in community college students, HBCU students, is to say, actually, everybody has a role to play in meaningfully engaging with these systems and giving feedback directly to companies. So this isn't about, being mad on social media. It's actually about like a structure. I call it structured public feedback. It is a formal way for people to be engaged in the process of improving these models and pointing out problems. The second thing is, I'm very passionate about algorithmic assessment as a career, right? So while this isn't directly related to getting a job in it, one of my hopes, and one thing I did see in that room, was people saying things like, oh, I didn't realize you could just actually go do this. And maybe it sparks interest in someone to want to start pursuing this as a career, right? And I know you get it with All Tech is Human. You're building such a massive community of people. And often what you probably hear is like, I didn't realize I could get a job in this. Like, I just thought, that either I go build technology or I am the recipient of what that person builds. I didn't even realize there was an entire community of practice in helping improve how AI is built.
Yeah, exactly. There are so many people within our community who are interested specifically in, what you're describing, algorithmic assessments in various ways, and seeing that they can actually build a career in that. Over the last, half a year to a year, we've been seeing a lot more people really wanting to dig in and learn how to do that. Kind of going back a second to what you described around, when you were talking about the public versus expert, one of the things that stood out definitely was the need for diversity in who we're bringing in, who's coming to the table, the variety of lived experiences that can press on the limitations of these models. And one thing in the report itself that I thought was so interesting, one of the sections you entitled, you talked about democratizing the definition of desirable behavior in LLMs. And I was thinking how important it is to have a diverse group of people to be able to do that democratization of what desirable behavior is. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the importance of diversity in the public red teaming as well as expert red teaming.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why public red teaming is so important, right? So ultimately, while there's a lot of technical wrappers around what safe, secure, and trustworthy AI means, if fundamentally I'm going to draw from my experience working at Twitter, right? These are actually policy decisions. Like, guardrails are technical things that are built around a policy decision of what the people in charge have decided what is and is not desirable behavior. So what is good? What is our goal? What is the appropriate way to talk about the Holocaust? What is the right way to engage if somebody seems like they have misogynistic behavior? Like, how does the model react to it? And these are some of the things we were testing and looking at. But ultimately, somebody has to make a decision of what is good, what is bad, what is right, and what is wrong. And right now, it's entirely companies, and they are, trying to pull from a wide range of people to inform that, like processes like RLHF, kind of abstractly try to understand values, but just like getting that direct input from people that, like, this is how I want to see this, how I don't want to see this at scale from a wide range of people who fit a particular demographic, right? So the hard part, and this is not unique to tech, this is just hard in general. If you say you want to represent the views and values of the LGBTQ community, right? Like, who has been crowned the leader? There is no leader. It is a community of people, all of whom may have very differing perspectives. So how do you respect this wide range of values? So diversity is absolutely key, especially in public red teaming. And as I mentioned, it's to capture the perspectives of people who are not traditionally represented in building these models and putting them into the model development and evaluation process. And then also, as I mentioned, hopefully opening this up as a field of inquiry for people to say, hey, I actually can go get a job doing this kind of work. And my lived experience actually is a benefit and, not a negative in this room.
Yeah, I also want to touch on something you mentioned earlier when you were talking about, operationalizing the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. I think that was an important decision to make, and I wanted to unpack a little bit around that decision and why you chose to operationalize that as opposed to, for instance, the NIST AI RMF. I just think that's a really wonderful decision to make, and wondered if you could tell us a little bit about why you made that choice.
Yeah, I mean, First of all, they're actually fairly aligned documents. And I see the RMF as more of a process document, like it's telling you how you should go about exploring this if you are at an organization. It aligns loosely to, obviously, to values that are articulated, but it's basically saying, like, as the word framework implies, like, here's how you go and do it. Versus the blueprint and the ABOR was like a list of things. Like, it's a bill of rights. It's a list of things. And what I loved about it is, and solving this problem, not that we fully solved it, but like addressing this problem or tackling it really gets at the core of what often blocks responsible AI from moving from theory into practice, right? We have these articulated goals that we want, and it's really powerful that came out of the White House, that came out of the OSTP. So it's not like Rumman's wish list of what she wants to see. This is articulated by OSTP, by the White House. Great. So now that we've gotten this vision and direction, how do I make it a reality, right? So one small part of it is figuring out how to design tests and evaluations of whether or not your models are aligning with it. So it was like a very clear pathway of saying, these are like 10 things that have been articulated. Let's design tests around these specific 10 things. And again, I feel like people were really, one very interesting thing I'm going to note about the feeling in that room. So we had 2,200 people over 2.5 days, just like an immense amount of people. And for people who get to dig into the data, you'll see all sorts of views represented, right? The most interesting thing that a bunch of people pointed out was that the room was actually very optimistic. And I have seen this, and we've done red teaming exercises with the Royal Society, with Autodesk, and it's always the same thing. You would think that an exercise designed to find problems would be very negative. But what I have found is that when you're giving people an opportunity to engage critically and they're getting their hands on the thing, the prevailing mood in the room is optimism. That like, oh, maybe there is something we can do. Maybe there are people out there that are trying to make things right and make things better. So like I've always found that to be the best part about doing these exercises.
That's awesome. I wanted to talk a little about some of the findings as you're putting the transparency report together and digging through what happened at the event and what people came up with. Wondered if you could talk a little bit about, did any of the results surprise you?
Well, I don't know if we had an expectation, a clear expectation, of exactly what we would find. And, we're entering with a scientist mindset, right? That we're there to explore and learn, not to dictate what the output should be. I think a couple of things that were really interesting, we looked at sort of high level model behavior. What we did not want this to be, it was an exercise in pointing fingers of like, this model did better than that model. Like, it's kind of a silly way to do things, but more to think about like the class of large language models as a whole and how they perform. So one really interesting finding, I would say, is that people are often very concerned about radicalization as it relates to algorithmic systems. This is a problem we saw with social media models, right? But what we found is that language models either kind of matched the energy, which one could say can contribute to radicalization, or in some cases, the models actually kind of de-escalated and, sort of backed off from the conversation, which is an indication of guardrails well built, right? That the guardrails were well built to identify somebody who was potentially radicalizing, looking for validation for radicalizing behavior, and de-escalated or sort of did not contribute to it. So I thought that was actually very interesting. It was very fascinating to me that there's a way to think of these systems so that we're trying to build protections into them.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that surprised me as I was looking through it was around the false premise idea and how there's seems to be this relationship between LLM chatbot hallucinations or inaccuracies in the outputs, yes, and the fact that the chatbots are designed to please the user. So yes, that was really fascinating to me, thinking through, I hadn't considered before that some of the inaccuracies might actually be because the conversational structure can itself reveal user preferences, and that can impact the outputs.
Thank you for bringing that up. So in cybersecurity, is often called social engineering, right? So there are ways in which malicious actors can defraud organizations, but I'd say like calling and, pretending to be a mom with a baby in the background and saying, oh my God, my baby's crying and my husband's at work and I really need the password for the bank. Like, can you help, and just sort of create a situation. And what I realized is that, and this is interesting because part of like the fundamental design of how we interact with language models, or how the design has been built to make us think that AI models are more human than they actually are. So, and it's also very interesting in light of Google saying that they want to replace search engines with a lot of AI, right? So people don't interact with an AI system, especially these large language models, in the same way they would interact with a search engine. And what we found in this and other subsequent and subsequent red teaming exercises is that people will often share information about what they want and why they want it. And also, if you come in saying, like, acting like an expert in something, the model is more likely to just reinforce how you feel about the thing. So it's one thing to say, what's the capital of some country, right? Like, what's the capital of Canada, versus saying, and then arguing with the model by saying, well, no, like, that's not the capital, this is the capital. So one example is if somebody asked it, why is copper the primary export of Iran? Copper is not the primary export of Iran, but the model like makes up an answer because you came in with this presupposition, and that may be malicious. Or one could see if somebody is just fully misguided and asking the model something, how might it produce, let's say, incorrect information around COVID? If I'm a COVID denier or a vaccine denier, and I'm going in and I'm saying, well, how's vitamin C going to cure COVID? How much vitamin C should I take, right? Which is misinformation. What might the model say? Because you have come in as an expert, you've not come in with a state of inquiry. Whereas versus a search engine, it would just actually give you the factual information that is out there, right? Because fundamentally, LLMs are not information retrieval systems, they're information synthesis systems. That's like a pretty big difference. And that right there is how that difference between two types of models may lead to a bad outcome in the real world.
Yeah, that's fascinating. A couple of other things I thought were pretty interesting, just looking through the four categories that you were pressing on, of factuality, bias, misdirection, and cybersecurity. In the misdirection category, that there was a lot of bad math happening. There
was a lot of people love themselves some bad math. Yeah, I think there's two things. One is, it's interesting, we talk a bit in the paper about how the design, like thinking forward to how people might do these kinds of things in the future, how the design is so critically important, how you frame the questions, what you say, the examples you give, even things like what order the question is given to people matters and influence. So bad math was one of the first questions people saw, and second, one of the easiest to tackle. So the reason we saw so much bad math actually was pretty easy to get those points. So like one of the things about the system wasn't designed, this competition it wasn't designed as a typical red teaming exercise. It was a competition. We want to make it fun, engaging, etc. Right? So we knew that people were going to focus on things that would get them the most points. Like, everyone's going to game the system. And that was something people loved gaming. It was like super fun for people. But it is interesting because now we're seeing AI being pushed as this educational, as like an educational tutor. And I don't know to what extent people who are fine-tuning models for LLMs to be used as, let's say, a math tutor, are thinking through the fact that these models are very easy to break and very simple. Like, you can argue with that 2 + 2 is 5 and win. So how are you supposed to make a calculus tutor out of this if I can convince a base language model, not fine-tuned on math, that 2 + 2 is 5?
Yeah. Yeah. And similarly with geographic misinformation being one of the easiest things to find. And then one other thing I thought was really interesting was how successful attempts to break the model tended to, it seemed like they were lengthier. Like, there was more that had to go into that. And was that, can you tell me a little about that part of it?
Yeah, there's sort of two ends. This one is maybe a slightly more hopeful conclusion, right? And you're correct. Like, the best way to get a model to do something bad or wrong is to have a repeated, prolonged interaction with it. Generally, the longer the length of interaction, so multi-turn interaction, tended to lead to a bad output, because you would have to argue with the model or reason with the model or convince it of something, versus it just coming out of the gate with a bad outcome. So that's interesting for two ways. One is there's a preponderance of focus on prompt hacks, so ways in which you can trick or fool the model. I worry a little bit that too much focus on prompt hacks ignores the social engineering component of it, whether intentional or unintentional, because social engineering has nothing to do with like finding this master prompt to break the model, right? And it takes a lot of effort for somebody to be actively engaged and maliciously trying to break a model to do something. So, on the plus side, it is not the easiest to get the model to have bad output. You have to be kind of going in with like this vision of, I want the model to do X. That being said, again, like if companies are trying to build these models, and now there's all this talk of AI agents that are going to go do all this stuff for you, the intent actually is for you and me and everybody on this call to engage repeatedly with these AI models. So are we going to then result in an extended multi-turn fabrication of a fake filter bubble that I get to live in because I'm constantly shaping this AI model to be responsive to what I want versus what reality is?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And then one other thing I thought was interesting around what types of attacks worked well. It seemed like the chain of thought attacks, like the more step by step, was more effective too, which kind of
and
the same thing.
Right, and that reinforced a lot of the literature out there. Again, like I think it was very trendy last year to focus a lot on these like individual prompt hacks. So I suppose the good part about that is those are easier to build guardrails for. Once we know that a certain hack is the thing, companies can go build a guardrail. It is much, much harder to try to do something like derive intent from a repeated interaction, right? And this is where you have to be super careful. It's very easy, like calibrating what isn't appropriate. Back to your question about, who gets to define what appropriate behavior is. These are policy decisions, right? They're policy decisions that are enacted in code. And that's the most important part. There is one thing that's hard to do is to derive intent. If someone's saying, give me step-by-step instructions on how to do X, or I really need to know how to do Y, the hack itself isn't telling you whether it's a good or a bad thing that the person's trying to do, right? And you have to, in a sense, dig into intent, which often ends up being kind of a hard place to be in, because there can be very well-intentioned people asking difficult questions, and that's totally fine.
Yeah. So as I kind of think through what the generative AI red teaming challenge, how that fits into the larger mission and goals of humane intelligence, just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about those larger goals and what humane intelligence is doing right now.
Yes, so we are focused on building the community of practice for algorithmic assessors. And just today, we launched our first algorithmic bias bounty program. So with the support and funding from google.org, we're doing 10 of these programs. And they're meant to reflect the hands-on practice of what somebody would do if they, let's say, got a job at a company to understand the impact of algorithms. They are by design socio-technical. So these are not just pure technical solves. You have to think about and sometimes engage with people who are thinking about this in the real world. Our first challenge is designed around making a proactive likelihood estimator that a prompt would lead to a bad outcome. And I really love this challenge because it gets people to think proactively about things rather than try to figure out what the intent of somebody is or stopping a bad thing after it happens. What does it look like if we try to create a way of figuring out if a prompt is likely to lead to a bad outcome? So I find that super interesting. The second thing about it is that it is meant for practitioners of all skill levels. So if you're a beginner to this and you don't really get what it means to build a likelihood estimator or what that even means, it's okay, because we're starting from first principles. We're actually starting from the DEF CON data. I think one of the biggest things that I would love to impart to people who are entering this field or thinking about this field is that it is hard. There is no silver bullet. You do not solve racism in models with one bias bounty or one program. Like, this is a constant evolving process. But also, it's okay that it's hard. And sometimes that's the fun part, right? We're going to incrementally make change. We're going to try things out and try to improve on what we've built. And the spirit of the bias bounty program is exactly that. We want to build a community of practitioners who are all just going to learn together. The secret is nobody really knows how to evaluate generative AI models. It's actually very undefined. Companies are figuring it out too. So it's great if everybody in the world is part of this process.
Yep, and All Tech is Human is incredibly proud to be joining you for this first bias bounty that's going to be coming up. So we I know it launched today, and we will be hosting an event together in New York on July 9th. So everyone can watch for more details about that, which will be coming soon. So yeah, Rumman, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who is tuning in today. Want to encourage everyone to stay involved with All Tech is Human. You can subscribe to our newsletter at alltechishuman.org. And then also, please participate in the Bias Bounty Challenge. You can find info about that at humane-intelligence.org, and everyone can be involved in that. So whatever skill level, as Rumman was saying, beginner, intermediate, advanced, there are cash prizes, thanks to google.org. And yeah, we're really excited about what's next. So thank you so much, Rumman, for joining me today.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, and we will see everybody next week. We have another All Tech is Human live stream, so tune in every week with us right here on our LinkedIn, and you can find all the videos after the fact on our YouTube channel. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.